The construction crew had been working in Grace Coleman's backyard for 3 days before she realized the new retaining wall wasn't on her neighbor's property at all. It was on hers, 18 inches past the surveyed line, and nobody from next door had said a single word to her about it. "It's a landscaping enhancement," Vanessa Caldwell said, standing at the edge of her own patio in designer sunglasses, waving a manicured hand toward the crew like the explanation was self-evident. "It barely touches your side. Honestly, Grace, I'd think you'd appreciate the improvement to the view." What Vanessa didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to check before her contractor broke ground, was that Grace had spent the last 2 days quietly pulling every document she needed to prove exactly where her property ended and Vanessa's began. And in about 3 weeks, a deputy would stand in that same backyard, look at a survey stake driven into freshly poured concrete, and ask Vanessa a single question that would end the conversation entirely. "Ma'am, can you explain why there's a permanent structure built past a recorded property line?" Vanessa wouldn't have an answer. Not because she didn't have money or connections or a name that opened doors most people in this town had never even seen. She had all of that, and she'd been counting on it working the way it always had. What she hadn't counted on was a homeowner who wasn't interested in being intimidated by any of it, and a system that, for once, wasn't going to bend just because someone expected it to. This is the story of how one of the wealthiest families in a gated community full of wealthy families learned, in front of a deputy and a stack of certified paperwork, that money can build a very expensive wall. It just can't build one on someone else's land and expect nobody to notice. To understand how it got to that backyard, that survey stake, that moment where Vanessa Caldwell's confidence finally ran out of runway, you have to go back to the day the construction trucks first showed up and a homeowner who, unlike most of her neighbors, wasn't willing to just look the other way. Grace Coleman was 46, a hospital administrator, and she'd lived in the Ashford Point gated community for 7 years, in a comfortable but modest home relative to most of her neighbors, a 4-bedroom house she and her late husband had bought together before he passed, on a lot backing up to a quiet greenbelt. Ashford Point wasn't the kind of neighborhood most people associated with typical HOA disputes over mailbox colors and trash can placement. It was upscale, with sprawling custom homes, an 18-hole private course, and an HOA board largely populated by residents who treated their annual dues less like an obligation and more like a membership fee for a country club. Grace, by her own admission, was one of the more modest households in the community, and she'd always felt slightly out of step with some of her neighbors, though she'd never had a real problem with any of them until Vanessa and her husband bought the house next door 18 months earlier. Vanessa Caldwell came from money, married into more of it, and had a reputation, even within a neighborhood full of wealthy people, for being particularly unbothered by rules she found inconvenient. She'd redone her landscaping twice without submitting the required architectural review paperwork, both times paying a modest fine without complaint, treating it, as one neighbor later put it, like a parking ticket instead of an actual correction. Grace's property line with the Caldwells' lot was clearly established, recorded on the subdivision's plat map and reflected in both deeds, running along a low decorative hedge that had marked the boundary since before either family moved in. It wasn't a matter of interpretation. The line had been surveyed and certified when Ashford Point was originally developed, and nothing about either property's boundaries had changed since. In early spring, Vanessa decided she wanted an expanded outdoor entertaining space, a larger patio, a stone retaining wall, and a built-in fire feature, connected to her existing pool deck. She hired a contractor, and construction began without any permit posted, without any HOA architectural review submission on file, and as Grace discovered 3 days in, without the retaining wall actually staying on Vanessa's side of the property line. Grace noticed it almost by accident, standing at her kitchen window one morning, watching the crew set forms for poured concrete that extended noticeably past the hedge line that had always marked the boundary. She went outside to look more closely and confirmed what her eye had already told her. The new wall's footprint crossed well onto her side of the property, cutting off a strip of her own backyard that included a young magnolia tree she and her husband had planted the year before he died. She mentioned it to Vanessa that same afternoon, politely, assuming it was likely just a contractor's miscalculation. "Oh, it's fine," Vanessa said, barely looking up from her phone. It's like a foot and a half. Nobody's going to notice, and honestly, it makes the whole yard flow so much better. I'll have my landscaper throw in some plants on your side to make up for it." Grace explained calmly that it wasn't about a foot and a half of grass. It was about a permanent concrete structure sitting on land that belonged to her, without her permission, and that the magnolia tree in that strip meant something to her that had nothing to do with property value. Vanessa's expression shifted into something faintly amused, the kind of look people give when they've decided a conversation isn't really worth taking seriously. "I really don't think this needs to become a whole thing, Grace. I'll talk to my contractor. It's really not that big a deal." 3 days later, the wall was finished, exactly where it had been when Grace first raised the issue. Grace walked the length of the new wall herself that weekend, using a tape measure and comparing it against her own copy of the property survey she'd requested from the county the day after her first conversation with Vanessa. The numbers were unambiguous. The wall sat at its closest point, 22 inches onto Grace's property, and at its farthest closer to 3 feet. Enough to have completely buried the base of the magnolia tree's root system under several inches of compacted fill dirt. She went next door that afternoon, survey in hand, and found Vanessa near the new patio, admiring the finished work with a glass of wine. "Vanessa, I had the property surveyed. This wall is on my land, not a foot and a half, closer to 3 feet at the far end, and it's buried the root ball of the tree I planted for my husband." Vanessa's amusement faded into something more clipped. "I really think you're overreacting. It's landscaping, Grace. People adjust boundaries informally all the time in neighborhoods like this. It's not some big legal issue." "It is a legal issue," Grace said, keeping her voice level despite how much the sight of the buried tree had unsettled her. "This is a permanent structure on my property, built without my permission, without an HOA architectural review, and without a permit as far as I can tell. I need it addressed, either moved back to your side of the line, or a formal agreement in writing if you want to keep it there. Do you have any idea what a variance and a redesign like that would cost me at this point? The wall's already poured. That's not something I created, Vanessa. I told you about the boundary before construction finished. You chose to keep going." Vanessa's tone shifted, sharper now, the pleasant hostess persona dropping away entirely. "I've been more than patient with some of the ways this community handles things, because frankly, most of what the HOA enforces around here is honestly kind of beneath people at our level. But if you want to make this difficult, I have relationships on that board that go back years. I'd think carefully before turning a foot of dirt into a war." It was such a direct, almost casual threat that Grace actually paused, processing it. Not a denial, not an offer to fix it, just an implication that Vanessa's standing with the board mattered more than a surveyed property line. "I'm not trying to start a war," Grace said. "I'm asking you to correct something that's on my property without permission. That's a reasonable request, regardless of who you know on the board." "We'll see," Vanessa said, turning back toward the house. "I'll have my HOA contact look into whether this is even something worth their time." Grace left without pushing further, though she felt, walking back across the hedge line, a distinct sense that looking into it wasn't going to mean what a reasonable person might assume it meant. That evening, she called the county recorder's office and requested a certified copy of both property surveys, along with the original subdivision plat map, wanting something official in hand rather than relying only on her own tape measure and a printed copy she'd pulled online. Grace's answer was simple. She wasn't interested in a fight, and she wasn't interested in Vanessa's connections. She just wanted the wall off her land, or a fair, documented resolution if it stayed. She filed a written complaint with the HOA that week, attaching her survey, and waited to see what looking into it actually turned into. What it turned into wasn't a resolution. It was an escalation Grace hadn't fully anticipated. 10 days passed with no response to Grace's written complaint. Then, unexpectedly, Grace received her own compliance notice from the HOA, not about the wall, but about her magnolia tree, now partially buried under the retaining wall's fill dirt, which the notice claimed was an overgrown, non-conforming landscaping feature encroaching on the shared aesthetic corridor between properties, and requested it be removed within 30 days. Grace read it twice, stunned by the audacity of it. The tree that had been quietly buried without her permission was now being cited as a violation, on a notice that made no mention whatsoever of the retaining wall actually sitting on her land. She called the HOA management office directly, and after being transferred twice, finally reached someone who admitted, somewhat uncomfortably, that the notice had been drafted at the specific request of a board member, though the representative wouldn't confirm which one on the phone. Grace didn't need the confirmation. She already knew. She called Vanessa directly that evening. "You had a compliance notice issued against my tree. The tree that's buried under a wall built on my property." "I didn't issue anything," Vanessa said smoothly. "The board reviewed the situation and made its own determination. I'm not sure why you're assuming I had anything to do with that. Because you told me a week and a half ago that you had relationships on the board that go back years, right after I told you the wall was on my property. I really don't appreciate the accusation, Grace. Maybe the board just noticed something that needed addressing. You'd know that if you actually read the covenants instead of assuming everyone's out to get you." Grace didn't respond to that directly. She hung up, sat down at her kitchen table, and for the first time in this entire situation, felt something shift from frustration into real concern. This wasn't just a boundary dispute anymore. It was starting to look like an organized effort to pressure her into dropping the issue by making her own property the target of enforcement instead. For days later, a second notice arrived, this one referencing the original complaint, stating that if the tree wasn't removed within the deadline, the HOA reserved the right to have it removed at Grace's expense, with an additional administrative fee attached. And beneath the standard board signature line, this letter carried a second signature, Vanessa Caldwell, listed for the first time as a newly appointed member of the Architectural Review Subcommittee. Grace stared at the signature for a long moment. Whatever informal influence Vanessa had implied having on the board had apparently, in the space of 2 weeks, become an official position with actual authority over exactly the kind of dispute Grace was caught in. That weekend, walking her dog past the shared hedge line, Grace found Vanessa outside again, this time with a different, colder edge to her tone. "I hope you're taking the notice seriously," Vanessa said. "I'd hate for this to turn into something that actually costs you money, on top of everything else." "On top of what else, Vanessa? You built a wall on my land. I haven't done anything except ask you to fix it. I think you're going to find that people around here take a very different view of who's being unreasonable," Vanessa said. "And honestly, if you keep escalating this, I won't have any choice but to have someone look into whether there's a pattern of harassment here. I don't think you understand how uncomfortable this has made things for me." Grace went home and for the second time in 2 weeks, sat down and organized everything methodically. The original survey, the county's certified plat map, both compliance notices, and now a written timeline of every conversation with Vanessa, dated and as close to word for word as she could recall. She didn't confront Vanessa again. She simply documented and waited. For almost a week, things went quiet. No new notices. No confrontations at the hedge line. The HOA's regular monthly bulletin came out on schedule, full of ordinary announcements about pool maintenance and an upcoming charity gala, without a single mention of trees, walls, or compliance disputes. Grace almost let herself relax. She spent the weekend catching up on work, had a quiet dinner with a close friend from the hospital, and for a few days, life in Ashford Point looked, at least on the surface, like it had before any of this started. A neighbor 2 doors down, a retired attorney named Harold, who'd served on the board years earlier before stepping back due to health reasons, mentioned to Grace in passing at the community mailbox that he'd heard secondhand that at least one other board member had quietly questioned how Vanessa had been appointed to the architectural subcommittee so quickly and why a compliance notice involving her own neighbor had gone out under her signature at all, given the obvious conflict of interest. Grace appreciated hearing it, but the quiet didn't fully settle her nerves. Everything she'd learned about Vanessa over the past several weeks suggested she wasn't the type to simply let a dispute go, especially not one where she'd already committed, publicly and repeatedly, to being in the right. She kept her folder current regardless, the surveys, the notices, the timeline, and now Harold's comment as well, jotted down with the date. She didn't post anything about it in the community forum. She simply kept it close, ready, the way she'd learned to keep any document she might genuinely need. On a Thursday evening, watering the small perennial bed near her back porch, Grace noticed Vanessa standing at the edge of her own patio, wine glass in hand, watching in Grace's direction for a long moment before turning and going back inside without a word. The following Tuesday afternoon, a patrol vehicle from the county sheriff's office pulled up outside Grace's house. The deputy who arrived introduced himself as Deputy Harmon, a calm, unhurried man who walked the shared property line with a measured pace before saying much of anything. Vanessa was already standing near her own patio when he arrived, having apparently called ahead and requested he meet her there directly. "Afternoon," Harmon said, glancing between the two women. "I got a call about a possible harassment situation involving a property dispute. Can someone walk me through it?" Vanessa spoke first, her tone polished and composed. "Officer, I'm on the HOA's architectural committee here, and unfortunately, my neighbor has become increasingly aggressive over what's really a minor landscaping matter. She's accused me, without basis, of manipulating board decisions, and she's been sending what I describe as escalating, confrontational messages. I felt it was important to have this documented before it goes any further." Grace, standing a short distance away, kept her tone even despite the frustration building underneath it. "Deputy, that's not accurate. I sent one direct message asking that a retaining wall built on my property, without my permission, be corrected. I have a certified survey confirming the wall crosses my property line by nearly 3 feet at its widest point, and it's buried the root system of a tree I planted for my late husband. After I raised that, my own tree was cited in a compliance notice, one that Ms. Caldwell personally signed after being appointed to the architectural committee less than 2 weeks after our first conversation about the wall." "Ma'am," Harmon said to Vanessa, "do you have documentation confirming the wall's placement relative to the property line?" "My contractor handled the layout," Vanessa said. "I trusted his measurements." "Do you have a copy of those measurements or a permit for the structure?" There was a pause, longer than the ones before. "I'd have to check with him." Grace stepped forward and handed Deputy Harmon a folder. The certified county survey, showing the recorded boundary with clear coordinates, the subdivision's original plat map, both compliance notices, including the one bearing Vanessa's signature, and her written timeline of the conversations between them. Harmon reviewed the documents methodically, walking a few paces along the wall itself, comparing its visible footprint against the survey's noted boundary. He crouched briefly near one section, where a metal survey stake, driven into the ground years earlier when the subdivision was platted, sat now partially embedded in the poured concrete of the new wall. "This survey stake is inside the wall's footprint," he said, mostly to confirm it aloud. "And this certified document places the recorded boundary right about here." He looked up at Vanessa. "Ma'am, this structure appears to be built substantially onto Ms. Coleman's property, based on county records." "That stake could have shifted," Vanessa said, though with noticeably less conviction than she'd carried minutes earlier. "These are typically set in a way that doesn't shift on its own, and it lines up with the survey Ms. Coleman provided," Harmon said. "Do you have any permit on file for this construction?" "It's landscaping. I wasn't told a permit was required." A permanent retaining wall of this size generally does require one, and regardless, a permit wouldn't authorize building on a neighboring property without that owner's consent. He turned to the second notice in the folder. "This compliance letter about a tree on Ms. Coleman's own property. You signed this as a committee member, is that right?" "I was recently appointed. I felt it was a legitimate concern. The tree in question is on her deeded property, and according to this timeline, it was cited shortly after she raised concerns about your wall. Do you see how that might look like the notice was retaliatory rather than a neutral compliance decision?" Vanessa didn't answer that directly. Harold, the retired attorney, had wandered a short distance down the sidewalk with his own dog, close enough to observe without approaching, and Grace noticed Vanessa glance toward him, visibly aware, for what seemed like the first time, that this conversation had an audience beyond just the deputy. Deputy Harmon closed his notepad and addressed both women plainly, without any satisfaction in his tone, simply laying out the facts as they stood. "I'm not seeing a criminal matter here today. so I won't be taking enforcement action personally. But Ms. Coleman, you're well within your rights to pursue a formal boundary dispute, and given what I'm seeing here, a certified survey, a buried survey marker inside the new structure, and a compliance notice that appears to directly follow your complaint, I'd strongly encourage documenting all of this for the HOA's board and, if needed, an attorney. He turned to Vanessa. Ma'am, as a member of the architectural committee, I'd be cautious about issuing compliance actions involving a neighbor you're currently in a boundary dispute with. That's the kind of conflict of interest that tends to look a lot worse the more it gets examined. And calling for a welfare or harassment check without something specific to point to isn't something I'd recommend making a habit of. I genuinely thought the tree was overgrown, Vanessa said quietly. Some of her earlier composure gone entirely. That may be, Harmon said, but the timing and the signature make that a hard case to make convincingly. I'd sort this out through the proper channels before it becomes something more formal than it needs to be. He thanked them both, gave Grace a brief nod, and returned to his vehicle. Vanessa stood near her patio for a long moment, wine glass forgotten on the table behind her, before finally going back inside without another word. The consequences unfolded over the following weeks, quietly but thoroughly. Grace formally requested the full board review, both the wall's encroachment and the compliance notice against her tree. Harold, drawing on his legal background, helped her frame the complaint clearly, and two other board members, uneasy about the conflict of interest question Deputy Harmon had raised, pushed for an independent review rather than leaving it to Vanessa's committee. The board ultimately ordered the wall's encroaching section removed and rebuilt entirely on Vanessa's side of the line, at her own expense, and rescinded the compliance notice against Grace's tree, with a written acknowledgement that it should never have been issued by a board member with a direct, undisclosed conflict of interest. Vanessa was removed from the architectural committee less than a month after her appointment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no public shaming, no viral confrontation. It was simply the paperwork, once someone finally forced a real look at it, doing exactly what paperwork is supposed to do. In the weeks that followed, Grace's backyard slowly returned to what it had been before the construction crew ever arrived. The wall came down and went back up several feet to the north, fully on Vanessa's property this time. The magnolia tree, though its roots had taken some damage from the fill dirt, was carefully uncovered and given a chance to recover under the guidance of an arborist Grace hired herself. When Harold asked about it over the community mailbox one afternoon, Grace mostly shrugged. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't assume that having more money or more connections meant she was automatically right. I got the actual survey, and I let that settle it instead of arguing about who knew who on the board. Vanessa, from what a few neighbors described in the months that followed, became noticeably more careful about property lines and permits on any future projects, and considerably quieter at HOA meetings than she'd been in her first 18 months in the community. Nobody treated it as a victory over wealth or status. It felt, more than anything, like a simple reminder that a recorded property line and a certified survey don't care how much money is standing on the other side of them. And that fairness, when someone actually takes the time to document it properly, tends to hold up regardless of who's involved. At its core, this was never really a story about money or status, or even about Vanessa Caldwell specifically. It was about what happens when someone assumes their wealth or their connections make the facts negotiable, and runs into someone who simply refuses to negotiate with a property line. Grace never raised her voice beyond a calm, steady tone. She didn't try to embarrass Vanessa publicly, and she didn't let herself get pulled into arguing about relationships or influence. She just got her survey, kept her documentation organized, and let it speak for itself when the moment finally called for it. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking the video and subscribing for more calm, grounded HOA and Karen Karma stories like it. We've got another one coming soon, involving a disputed shared driveway gate and a homeowner who kept far more evidence than anyone expected. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor or an HOA that assumed money or connections meant the rules didn't apply to them? Tell us what happened in the comments.